Okay, things happen. It goes, okay. We appear to be live. I watch and make sure it pops up on here. All right. I always ask, audio okay? Audio is good. I didn't even have to ask. Welcome. Hooray. Well, this is the community stand-up for May 26, 2020, and we're welcoming the Blazor team. And this is the Blazor WebAssembly release party. This is awesome.
Yay.
I actually hired a mariachi band and they had to cancel.
Pandemic, right? Pandemic. Social distancing.
I know, it's hard to get them these days. Yeah. So, but congratulations. It's been a journey, huh? So,
it has, yeah. Thank you.
When was the first Blazor demo? I believe that was NDC Oslo?
It was in 2017. So
wow.
We're not quite up to 3 years ago, but nearly 3 years ago. So yes, it's a long project.
Yep.
Not that we're finished, obviously.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, congratulations. I'm going to jump in and do my community links because I love the community and I love to show off the stuff they're doing. I have some cool Blazor links this week as well. We'll pop over into that. This is the URL list, so this will be in the show notes and everything, but these are the links I'm going to be showing.
Should we intro? Like, I don't know, have we ever introduced Safia? Like, Safia's
No, I'm sorry.
Let's go back to that. Make sure everyone knows who these luminous people are.
Yes, welcome Safia. So, okay, of course, Steve, the original inventor of Blazor and has been on ASP.NET and been building all kinds of crazy stuff. Including back to Knockout and a bunch of other stuff. Dan Roth, PM on the team, of course. And then Safia, welcome.
Hello.
So Safia, you're going to be showing some debugging stuff with Blazor.
Yes, I will.
And you are new to Microsoft and the team.
I am new-ish to Microsoft. I've been working at Microsoft for a year and a half now.
Oh, gosh. Okay.
But I've been on the Blazor team for all of 10 weeks. Okay. So.
Wow, and what were you working on before that?
So before I was on the Blazor team at Microsoft, I was working on a product called Azure Notebooks, which is kind of in the Jupyter Notebook sphere of things. A lot of the open source work that I do in my spare time is around Jupyter Notebooks and interactive computing. So that's my hobby.
Very cool. And so then you've been focused on, and so you're focused on Blazor debugging. Do you work just on that, or do you work on a lot of different Blazor stuff?
Oh, gosh. I work on a little bit of everything. It happens that as of recently, I've been doing a lot of stuff around debugging and VS Code. But, you know, whenever you join a new team at a company, you kind of like dive in head first and you're learning about all sorts of things. So I've contributed to Blazor WebAssembly, and now doing some stuff on our tooling with this debugging work. So I'm all over the place.
And had you been experienced with Blazor much before you joined the team, or was it a?
No, only in name and vague kind of notion that, oh, this is something out of Microsoft that's kind of new on the scene, but had never used it before. I'm actually not a big .NET developer. I spend most of my time writing JavaScript and Python. So this is all completely new to me, and it's been very fun learning about everything and kind of examining things from a fresh kind of new perspective. So cool. I'm definitely the new kid on the block.
Awesome. I am very much looking forward to your demos. That's going to be fun. So.
Nice.
All right. Okay. So apologies for that. We'd been talking for a bit and before the call, and we'd already done our personal introductions. Thanks for pointing that out, Dan. So, all right, back over to the community links. So here's what we have today. First of all, this is the 21st week. Shahed has been doing these series where he goes A through Z. And so he's looking at unit testing ASP.NET Core 3.1. So for this, he did a Twitter poll and people wanted to see XUnit. And so he went through and, showed off how to set up XUnit. So some of the things I want to point out in here, one is that he is using he's got his own NetLearner project that he's been using on these. And so he's been using that as kind of the example code that he's using on these different series. So One thing he goes through is the difference between a fact and a theory, which is very useful with XUnit, being able to parameterize your tests. So he shows how to set that up. We did that on the community stand-up page when we built that out. The original prototype for that, we used XUnit, and we used these theories and parameterized tests for all of our. We had a bunch of service code that we had to test, and that was really useful to go through and test it like that. So I think the one other thing that I just want to point out that well, two other things. One is I like that he goes through and points out different ways to do your testing. So of course in the Visual Studio interface, also .NET Test, and this is really useful to be able to test that way. And he mentions also that there's live unit test in enterprise version of Visual Studio. And then one thing I love that Shahed does on his post is he has a really nice references section at the end. So he goes through and just, shows his work and shows where you can go and read more information. Good stuff. Okay, Fernando has an app full stack demo, and here he's using Angular material, and he's using React Native, and then ASP.NET Core 3.1 as the backend. So I've been featuring more of these lately, these projects where people kind of put a bunch of stuff together and show a kind of, combining different things. So here he explains how it works. He's got a running demo that you can go out and look at. He does also have this React Native mobile. And then he spells out at the end that this is something where in his license, he specifically says, you can use this for a real world application and companies can use this as well. So I thought this was nice. All right, Project Tie. So Amy blogging about this. This is the announcement post from Build last week, and really cool to see this. So this is a full walkthrough using Project Tie. Showing how to create an application using Project Tie, and then walking through. This is based on the tutorials that they've written up, and I love the Project Tie tutorials. They're really nice, and I feel like they did a great job of writing the tutorials very early in the project, and that kind of drove. It felt like to me, as going through the tutorials, it felt like the tutorials helped drive the design of the project. So here they're walking through building the application, adding multiple services, running the services, and then some other more advanced things like creating a registry further down. And then also a nice thing, I'll skip down towards the end here, is they're also, Amy's talking about some of the backlog and plan things coming up in the roadmap. So it's exciting to see as well, things like, Dapper and Zipkin and support for other things. So, pretty cool. Another thing announced was YARP. So YARP is yet another reverse proxy, and we're definitely going to need a full show on this too. And we're already getting that lined up. I think it's in a couple of weeks. And so this is exciting to see this. This is pretty and also explaining what's in and what's out for Preview 1. So pretty quick walkthrough in here showing how to bring this in, bringing in Microsoft Reverse Proxy, configuring it, pulling in from a configuration section, and then mapping it. And that's really pretty much it. The configuration looks pretty straightforward to me. So I'm looking forward to a full show on this to dig in more.
Yeah, it's really showing how you can use .NET for high performance infrastructure pieces on the back end. And then have the full .NET extensibility model.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me too that this came up because multiple teams at Microsoft were building reverse proxies, and so that's good news to me because if they're all using this is, like you said, this is something that's going to be used in probably some high scale applications and dogfooded by Microsoft. So
yeah, there's a question whether that replaces IIS. I mean, obviously we need a whole session on YARP to explain what that's all about and get the YARP team on here. But I don't think so. I think you still need the server, right? It's just a reverse proxy in front of your servers.
I believe so. And then, I would like to understand more about what these teams are actually doing with it. I believe it could also be used, in some microservice situations, and yeah, I don't know, honestly. I'd like to understand it better. I think generally the guidance is if you have IIS available, you do want to use that. But cool. Okay, so Jeremy, this is a really nice in-depth post where he's writing up using Azure AD with Cosmos DB and then a Blazor WebAssembly application. So here we're shifting to the Blazor links portion of the show. This is a long, in-depth post. And I like some things in here. First of all, Jeremy said, I followed on Twitter, that he had not seen something where it was just well documented, the whole kind of process of how to do this. So he wanted to go through and kind of write it up as a, here is how to do it. He's been doing some more sketching, and I like his sketches in his posts. This is cool. So he's got a lot of those, and he explains some things like, of course, using Azure AD for the authentication, and then he digs in deep. He's working on the data story for .NET, and so he writes up how to connect to Cosmos from Entity Framework, and so and explaining all the token management, etc.
So he actually has Entity Framework running on WebAssembly to some extent there, right?
Yes.
So that itself is a novelty, to me at least. We haven't seen that really done in any deep way yet. So that's really interesting.
Yeah. So, and I haven't run it, but I believe he's got the source code posted, and I'd like to pop this open and just run it and play with the code. Cool. Dodi, so he's written hundreds of samples for .NET, and he keeps them up to date. So these are updated for the release WebAssembly 3.2.0, and here he's got all his samples, including some one thing that's really cool with Dodi's samples is they're very focused on one specific scenario. So he has some starting with a very tiny hello world, and then just some very kind of lightweight, here's, for instance, components calling into each other, child components, etc. So this is really cool, and just huge props to Dodi for updating these things consistently. And this is just, I'm linking directly to Dodi's Blazor ones, but his whole, if you look at his entire thing, it's just hundreds of them. So it's a machine. Here's one. I never do this, but I'm doing this today. This is including in the Blazor links. This is a post I got to work on. This is building a progressive web app with Blazor, and thank you both Dan and Steve for reviewing and commenting on this. So I went through and explained how to build this out, and I'm starting on a series here where I'm building a to-do application. So I'm using the to-do sample that's in the docs, and then I'm going to be adding in more PWA support. So Syed on my team, we were kind of brainstorming some things we could do, things like offline support and push notifications when you have a to-do task due and things like that. So I went through and did the kind of simple create the to-do application, then worked on installing, and I wanted to try also installing and testing with mobile support. And Steve, you pointed out the easy way that and the docs point this out too, is the easy way to test out offline support is just in the browser tools. You can simulate offline support. I also wanted to play with offline support in mobile. And so I went through and I used the ngrok tool. So you can do the free level works just fine for that. And so I ran ngrok, and that gave me an HTTPS URL, and then I tested installing that from the Android simulator and played with that. So yeah, neat stuff, and I'm looking forward to building more on this. All right, 2 more links, and then I'll pass over to you. I gotta repeat this one. Awesome Blazor is amazing. Updated yesterday, just tons of great stuff. So as a community link, this is one that this is a huge. This is just the place to keep an eye on. Follow the repository and keep an eye on this. People like Dan during our session where we were helping Proctor, and people were asking questions. They repeatedly pointed people over to this. They would say, I'm looking for information about this or that, and I would point them to that.
Yeah, if you're looking for component libraries or JavaScript interop libraries, test frameworks, like there's quite a bit of stuff that gets produced by the Blazor community to help you out with building your app, and that's where you can find a lot of that stuff. And we encourage, if you have a project that you have built in the Blazor space, like send them a PR, send a PR to the awesome Blazor repro so that other people can find it easier.
Cool. There's one that I don't have open here. There it is. Almost missed this one. Ed Charbonneau pointed this out to me. So this is Week of Blazor. So this is coming up, and this is 1st through the 5th of June. And they've got people scheduled, including this Dan Roth dude. Yeah. Anything else to say about this, Dan?
It's a full week of Blazor. I mean, what else do you need to know? Like, schedule vacation, block out your week. Like,
so
yeah, it's
much
gonna be
Blazor.
fun. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Wow. Good stuff. Okay, and the last post is the announcement post. So congratulations. Here's the thing. It's how to install it. Yay!
Woo!
Yeah. Anything you want to point out in this post specifically? I mean, walking through everything. What is WebAssembly and what's in the release? And
oh yeah, okay. So we have finally shipped, and it has, as we were talking earlier, it's been a bit of a journey. I think we've had 17 preview releases of Blazor WebAssembly-ish, around that number. So it's gone through a few rounds. It's had lots of great community feedback, contributions, and we have finally made it available for production use. So definitely go and check. Here, let me. I'm gonna share a slide if that's all right,
yes,
John.
Absolutely.
Pop up. This is the announcement slide that we showed at Build. That Blazor WebAssembly is now released. It's part of the .NET Core 3.1 SDK now. So if you have the latest version of the .NET Core SDK 3.1.300, then you've got Blazor WebAssembly. The template is just included. It's also ships with Visual Studio if you have 16.6, Visual Studio 2019 16.6, and also Visual Studio for Mac 8.6 has it in the box. So if you have those, you can just file a new project, your first Blazor WebAssembly app right away. It is fully supported. One point that we want to make sure people understand that because this is the first release of Blazor WebAssembly, we didn't want to make it an LTS release right off the bat. Like, we tend to like to ship something at least once before we bless it with an LTS support cycle. So this release does not inherit the LTS status of 3.1, even though it ships in the 3.1 SDK. I know that can be a little confusing. To try to make that a little clearer, we revved the version of Blazor WebAssembly to 3.2, so that's kind of separate. This is a current release of Blazor WebAssembly. So that just means that when we ship Blazor WebAssembly again with .NET 5, that you'll need to upgrade to that version relatively soon after it ships. But that should be a highly compatible release, so the upgrade should be relatively painless. But it is fully supported, ready for production, ships with the SDK and Visual Studio. It's loaded with all sorts of goodies. These are the features that we listed out in the blog post. Support for .NET Standard. You can use your existing .NET libraries on the client and the server. You can host an ASP.NET Core. You can deploy your app as a standalone static site. We support authentication out of the box using ASP.NET Core Identity with Identity Server, or you can use Azure AD, Azure AD B2C, or any OpenID Connect provider. We have out-of-the-box support for progressive web apps that you showed earlier in your blog post. You can just create a progressive web app right from the beginning with Blazor WebAssembly. Support offline, support native OS integration. We have enabled support for debugging, both in the browser and in Visual Studio, and Safia is going to show the Visual Studio Code experience as well today, some of the improvements we've been working on there. IL trimming and pre-compression to reduce the app size as much as possible. Out-of-the-box support for configuration, as well as globalization and localization. So it's a pretty feature-rich release. And we're super thrilled that we've been able to make it available for folks. The uptick's been nice to watch as people have been downloading it, installing it. If you want to get started with it, just head on over to blazor.net and download the latest SDK, or just update your Visual Studio version, and you should have it. You should be all set to go. And I think what we're going to do is Steve's going to show it to us. Going to show us some of these awesome new features, and that way you can get a taste for what it's like to build apps with Blazor WebAssembly.
Yeah, fantastic. Let's do it. All right. So Dan just had this massive list of features in Blazor WebAssembly. And as part of this release, we wanted to have a new sample app that would give a demonstration of just about all of those features in one application. And so that's what I'm going to use to show off some of this stuff to you now. Let me just start sharing this screen, and then hopefully we can go and see some of this. So we've got this application here called Car Checker, which is it's a Blazor WebAssembly application. It's also got an ASP.NET Core server backend, and it's got quite a lot of functionality in it. So let me just show you a little bit of what this app can do, and then we'll dig into the code and see how it illustrates some of the features. So when I pop this up in my browser, you can see the first and only thing that a user can do initially is log in. So you might think, okay, well, like, who's going to log in? What kind of users does this app have anyway? Well, the scenario for this app is a car rentals company. So the idea is people hire cars from you, and then later on, obviously, they bring those cars back, and your staff need to check that the cars have been returned in good condition. They need to know that the fuel level is right, and they need to check for any damage that the user might have left on the vehicle. So the user for this application would be an employee at the car rental company. So they would come along maybe on a desktop device, or most likely on some kind of mobile device that they can take out into the parking lot. And the first thing they would have to do is log in. So this is illustrating some of the built-in auth and login features that is part of the Blazor WebAssembly release. So when I click on login, you can see it takes me to this server-rendered login page. This is ASP.NET Core's existing built-in login system. And I've already registered a user account for myself on there. So I'm just going to sign myself in. And when I do become signed in, then obviously instead of seeing that login screen, I'm going to see a different UI. And the thing that the user needs to do next is type in the license number of a vehicle that a customer is returning. So let's say they start typing. You can see we've got an autocomplete kind of thing going on there. And I'm going to choose one of these, and that will take me into the details for a particular vehicle that we know about. So if I'm the staff member, maybe the first thing I'll do is update the mileage that we know about. So maybe I'm gone a bit crazy and I'll type in an absolutely mad number that can't possibly be right. And you can see that we've got validation showing up there. Okay, so that's a good thing. Maybe I'll change the fuel tank level to reflect whatever the customer has returned. And you might notice that this save button has appeared up on the right. That's because this forms system is keeping track of the state of what has been edited in the form, and we know that there's a change, so we can prompt the user to click on save. Now, we've also got this cool looking 3D view down here. I'll explain more about how that's been implemented later. But if you're an employee, you could go out and walk around the car and check for any damage that might be on it and compare with what damage has already been recorded on the database. So you might come in and you might say, oh dear, there's some really bad scratching on this front corner here. So I'll click on that, and then I'll tap on add note. And maybe I'll just try to hit save without doing anything. Well, again, the validation system will jump in. So let's say it's really scratched. Okay, and then I'll hit save. And then we can see we've now got these 3 items. Very good. And I'll hit save again. And that will all get saved back to the server. Okay, so there's a lot of functionality in this application. We've got the auth system that I just mentioned. We've also got the forms validation. We've got some JavaScript interop going on. We've got a local client-side database that I'll show you in a minute. We've got full PWA support, so this can be installed and used offline. And we've got internationalization as well. So what I want to do is give you a little demo of going through these 6 different feature areas. And I'll show you some code in each case and maybe demonstrate adding a little bit more stuff. This is not going to be a super polished and formal demo. So I'm very happy to take questions as we're going along. So if any of the other speakers on the call want to just jump in and talk about stuff, you're very welcome to do so. And if questions get posted, then by all means interrupt me as well. Does that sound all right?
Yeah, it does. And that's when we talked about this before, that's one thing we're all excited about is that we can take questions during this. This is just a call with our friends to show it off. So please ask questions.
Awesome. All right. So while people are thinking of questions, let me start off with the first feature area to show you, which is to do with authorization. Now, I already showed you that I had to log in order to get into the application. But let's think about going beyond just knowing what a person's name is and think about actually protecting some data or some APIs that are on the backend server. So I'm going to go into my code and have a look inside the server project here. So, well, firstly, let's talk about these three projects. Okay, so we've got client, server, and shared. I know that most people on the call have probably seen this by now, but just for anyone who's new, by default with Blazor WebAssembly, you don't have to have an ASP.NET Core server if you don't want to, but you can. And of course, they work really great if you do. Now, in this case, I do. So I've got my client project, which is a Blazor WebAssembly app, and that works completely independently of the server if we want it to. We've got a server, which is an ASP.NET Core server, and that's dealing with some APIs and various bits of security stuff. And then I've also got this shared project with code that's shared between them. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But on the server, inside my controllers folder, I've got this vehicle controller. And that is where most of the backend APIs are. So this is where the client can fetch a list of the changed vehicles or the details of a particular vehicle and things like that. Now, at the moment, there's no actual access control. Anybody in the world can just hit it without even being logged in. So I want to change that, and I'm going to put the authorized attribute there on the server-side code. Now, I could apply things like rules around roles and policies and things like that. But for now, I'm just going to say authorized, which means in order to access this controller, you just have to be logged in. Now, I am logged in, but let's see what happens when I hit reload. Let's see if we can still interact with the backend APIs. You'll see now we get this error. It says it could not sync. And if we want to investigate that, let's pop open the browser's network tab, and we'll see what's actually going on the network there. When I click on retry, you'll see that the server is now replying with these 401 not authorized status codes, which is really good because that shows us that we have been able to enforce some kind of access control on the server. One of the basic rules of any sort of front-end programming is that you can't trust anything that happens on the client. All your real enforcement has to happen on the server. So that's what I've just done. I've restricted access to the API to logged-in users. Now, you might be thinking, well, I am logged in, as you can see, so why didn't it let me access that? Well, it's because I disabled some code that is needed. And I only did this just so that I can demonstrate the code to you, because by default, when you are talking to a backend API that's been nominated by your code, we automatically include the access tokens with all the requests. And that's what's needed for the server to accept your requests. But just so I can demonstrate that to you, I commented this out, which is normally not commented out by default. So what this code means is whenever we are talking to making HTTP requests to the server, which is on the same base address that the client is being served from, we use this base address authorization message handler, which is quite a long and scary name, but basically it means we're willing to include access tokens for any request to the backend. Okay, and that is on by default. I just turned it off so that we could see it not working. So if I turn that back on, then now because I'm logged in, we should send the access tokens to the backend server. And because all these things know how to work together, then instead of getting errors, we should now get 200 status codes. And if we really want to dig into that a little bit more, let's have a look at one of these requests. And I know it's kind of hard to see on the screen with this resolution, but one of the headers in the outbound request from the browser there is this authorization header, which includes this bearer token, which is what we got from the server when we signed in. So the point of all this is just to show you that out of the box, Blazor WebAssembly knows how to integrate with ASP.NET Core's conventions around access tokens, and you can automatically have the server and client know who the user is and enforce access control. Does that make sense? And were there any questions that came up at this point?
There were a few questions that were authentication sort of related.
Yeah.
Let me see. There was one. Okay, so there's a question about cookie authentication.
Yeah.
Asking if there could be a template or something that works with cookie authentication. Yeah,
it's a good question. All right. So to give more context, the kind of auth that we're doing here in the template by default is a JSON Web Token bearer authentication, and the client obtains the token from the server by going through the OAuth flow or OIDC more specifically. So that's a sort of general industry standard way of dealing with acquiring access tokens and the whole mechanism for describing who a user is. But a different, slightly older form of auth mechanism would just be plain old cookie-based auth. You log in some way or another, the server issues the user with a cookie, you send that cookie with your requests, and that's how the server knows who you are. That's really easy to set up with Blazor WebAssembly when it's hosted on an ASP.NET Core server, because it's all on a single domain. So by default, your cookies will just be sent with all the requests. And so it pretty much just works out of the box. We don't include a template for it because it's not really absolutely the recommended way to set up auth these days. I'm not perhaps the best expert to talk to about that, but cookie-based auth does have some additional complications to do with cross-site request forgery and dealing with things like token renewal and various other things that can be a little awkward with it. So we prefer the slightly more modern no-auth based system in the templates, but it's not very difficult to turn it on if you prefer regular cookie-based auth. But I don't have a specific sample for you. Was there any more?
One other just related also to login stuff is server-side rendered login register forgot password with identity going to be the recommended approach, or would client-side rendered be a normal supported approach? I think what you showed is a client-side rendered, right?
No, it's not. No, it was server rendered. So this part is all client rendered in WebAssembly. But if I go over here into my manage account, you'll see that everything that's under this identity prefix in the URL space, this is all coming from ASP.NET Core's traditional server rendered UI for logins, which is a really nice system. It's very extensible. We've got all the things like two-factor auth and such in there, and you can change how it's styled and everything. So it's a nice system, but it's not client rendered. It's possible that in the future we will switch to a client rendered model, but mainly we just didn't have time to do that for the initial release. But also there's certain arguments that people in the OAuth space make that it's considered a poor practice to integrate a login system into a SPA because it means that the user doesn't really know where they're giving their password to. I'm not going to get into that in too much detail because, like I say, I'm not an expert about that. But you can go and search and read the whole debate online about whether it's good or bad to have a separate login system when it comes to a SPA. But the main reason we didn't do it is just that we didn't have time.
Okay. One other question, and hopefully a quick one. Somebody asking Blazor WebAssembly integration with an MVC site. And is there it's the hosting is pretty much you could host it with PHP or whatever as a backend.
Yeah.
Is there an example that you'd point people to using MVC as a backend?
Yeah. So when you create your Blazor WebAssembly project, you can choose between. Let me just show you. So I'm sure many people will have seen this by now. But when you create your Blazor project, you choose between the server and the WebAssembly app model, and I don't have a slide for it. Okay, so the next thing that it asks you is how you want it to be hosted, whether you want it to be standalone or not. If you choose the hosted on ASP.NET Core, then it is hosted on an MVC site. Well, we don't really distinguish between MVC and Razor Pages or other flavors of ASP.NET anymore. So it is just an ASP.NET Core server, which can host MVC controllers if you want to. And inside this car checker project, that's exactly what I've got here. You see, I've got a controller. So it's kind of pretty much an out-of-the-box default to host on MVC.
Excellent. Great.
All right. Okay, so we just looked at some auth stuff. Let's talk about the next thing, which is code sharing. All right, now there's a few different angles to talk about here. And the first one is to do with how solutions tend to be structured with Blazor WebAssembly. I already mentioned this three-project system is a very common convention, and we do have a project template for it, even though you don't have to do it this way. And within the three-project system, it's very normal to have a shared project. And there's nothing magic about this. It's just a net standard class library, which gets used by the client and the server. And it gets used for quite a lot of stuff. Typically, people put things like their domain model classes in there. As you can see in this case, I've got classes to represent a vehicle and parts of a vehicle. Well, that's just an enum, and a note that someone's been added to a vehicle. And this gets used for quite a lot of stuff. In this particular example, it gets used to define the actual data schema of an underlying server-side database that gets inferred directly using EF from all of these attributes and the relationships between classes. So it's the database schema. It's also used to define the validation rules that the server will enforce on every single request to the API controllers. It's also used to define the validation rules that are used on the client, and it's also used to define the shape of the JSON traffic that is exchanged between the server and the client. So there's a huge amount of different stuff that's all being driven from the metadata within this project. Everything is built on this shared project. So there's a huge opportunity to share things that way, which is really nice. And to give you just another example of that, let's have a go at adding an extra validation rule so that I can show you a bit more forms and validation stuff. So if I go back to my site here and I go back into that car that we had before. So when I did this last time, I didn't actually add a photo. Let's say that I want it to be required that you must add a photo when you're adding a new item of damage. So I can simply go to this photo URL and say that it's required. And I'm going to give an error message. Let's say all damage must be photographed. Okay. All right, so that's a new rule, and that's going to be enforced by both the server-side logic when requests go to the server, as well as the client-side logic. So now if I reload stuff in the browser and I go back into that thing, now I try to save it, what we get now? We get an error. We get this all damage must be photographed. You simply can't save that. And it's also true, of course, if I choose to add some new damage. So if I click save there, you'll see that we've got the text field is required there and damage must be photographed. So we've immediately been able to share that logic between server and client. But there's a bit of a problem right now, which is that I don't have any way of actually adding a photo. If I click on this take new, it doesn't do anything. I'm clicking on it, but nothing happens. So why is that? Let's have a look. I'm going to go into my vehicle note editor. So this is a Razor component, which I know most viewers will be familiar with. This is how Blazor components are written. It's a combination of HTML and C# code mixed together in one delightful recipe there. And down here, this part of the form here is where the photo is dealt with. So we're dealing with the label. We'll talk about this localized thing later. This is where we're displaying the existing photo if there is one, and there isn't. This is where we display the validation message for it, and we'll talk about damage detection in a little bit. But right now, nothing actually reacts when you click on this label. So, nothing, I can't add a photo. So this brings me to the second form of code sharing that I want to talk about, which is sharing code from third parties, or particularly getting stuff from NuGet packages, which is one of the strengths of the .NET ecosystem. Let's say I want to have a way of taking and uploading photos. I don't have that in my app right now, but I'm going to go and I'm going to say manage NuGet packages. And then I'm going to search for a particular component library that I know about called Blazor input file, which I also wrote, which is why I trust it. And I'm going to click on this install button, and that is going to add Blazor input file to my project, which is very trivially going to give me the ability to take and upload photos. So now that's been added, I can say, okay, let's say I want an input file component. What is it called? I don't think it's updated yet. Let's try this again. Blazor. Okay, there we go. So at the moment, I have to give this prefix, which I don't really like very much. So I'm going to take this prefix like that, and I'm going to add a using statement for it. Okay, so now I won't need the prefix anymore. I can now just start adding an input file, and that is going to let me upload a photo. Okay, now I've already prepared a bit of logic that I need. So I'm going to say, I'm configuring the browser to say I only want the user to choose image files. And this also prompts mobile devices to use the camera UI when you click on it. And then when you do choose one, I want to call this C# method handle photo selected, which doesn't exist, and hence I'm getting an error message. So let's put that in. I've got all these different event handlers here, which I'm not going to explain. I'm just going to add a method called handle photo selected. And that's going to receive all the files that the user has chosen, because we support multiple selection, except in this case, we're only going to support one. So we'll just take whichever the first one is that you've picked. We're going to convert it to a JPEG file with a certain maximum resolution, and we're going to set that as the URL of the photo on this particular node. So I hope that makes sense. Let's see if we can now actually add photos to our notes that we're adding for the vehicles. So I'm recompiling that, and then I'll go back to the browser and I will reload. And when the server comes back up, okay, I'm now going to tap on that. This time I'll click on the photo, and you'll see that this time we get a file picker. Now you get different kind of UI depending on what device you're using. It's very different if you're on a mobile device. It'll prompt you to take a photo with the camera and so on. But on a desktop, it brings up the file picker, and we'll choose this particular photo there. And now I can hit save, and you see I don't get the error anymore. Now, I haven't added photos for these other things, so the server is actually going to reject the request if I try to save it with these other things. So I'm going to delete these other things just to save myself the trouble of dealing with that, and I'll hit save, and that all gets saved back to the server. Now, you might be wondering what this detect damage thing was going to be. If I click on that, that is kind of an unrelated demo, but it's cool. It uses ML.NET on the server to look at the photo that you've uploaded and detect whether it believes that the vehicle is damaged enough to charge the customer for the damage. So it's kind of unrelated to Blazor, but it's a cool thing. So I thought I would just show you anyway. So there you go. That's a few different code sharing things. Any questions or observations about that?
Well, two things. One on the car checker itself. So that code is up on GitHub, correct?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Yeah. So where is that? It's, okay. So this URL here, Steve Sanderson MS car checker, there's some kind of short link for it, but I can't remember. Anyway, people can take a screenshot of that and find their way to it. Yes.
And I'll include that in the show notes too. And then one other thing is the 3D animation thing is really cool.
Yeah.
And how did you do that? How is that handled?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So let's have a look. That's another example of code sharing, I suppose, but it's also an example of JavaScript interop. So in the vehicle editor, you will see that we've got this component here called Scene View. Now that is coming from an external NuGet package. That's another Blazor component. It's a very simple 3D viewer. It's quite limited. The only thing it lets you do is display a single object, and you give it the URL of the object itself in the form of a 3JS JSON file and an image that represents the background, and it just renders it. And it also gives you a callback if the user clicks on part of the 3D object. So it just uses whatever the hierarchy of the 3D object is. So I can click on these different parts, and it also gives you the ability to mark certain items as highlighted. So that's how the this side of the vehicle is highlighted there, because we've got some damage on it. It's not a super interesting component. I haven't actually published the sources for it. I will do, but no one's going to be very excited when they see it. It's really simple. But yeah, it uses 3JS on the inside, which is kind of an example of the JavaScript interop feature.
Very cool.
Right. Which conveniently is the next thing to talk about.
Awesome.
All right, so I've just shown you an example of how we can call out to a third-party JavaScript library. So this is using the 3JS library behind the scene, and it's all wrapped up inside a NuGet package. And that's really the easiest way to do JavaScript interop, is just to not do it, is to like use someone else's work that you just pull in from a NuGet package, and then you don't have to deal with it. You can just do coding in .NET, so that's really easy. But there are, of course, cases where you want to write your own JavaScript code and interop with it. And an example of that within this project is the database. Because one of the business requirements of this product, this car checker app, is that it needs to support full offline use, because the employees who are out in a parking lot checking vehicles, they don't necessarily have reliable Wi-Fi access. So they need to be able to search through the database and edit the vehicles and such without relying on network traffic. And to do that, we need a local copy of a vehicle database. And if we have a look over here in the browser's application tab, it's already expanded here. So inside the IndexedDB section here, you'll see that I've got this local database here. It's got 3 different tables in it, one to track edits that we haven't synchronized with the server, one to track just general metadata about stuff, and then we've got the data that's come from the server. So this is all incrementally synchronized, so we don't mind even if it's a giant database, and that contains all the vehicles that are known at this particular location, and like lots of information, such as all the notes that we've got about them. So that is all implemented inside a little JavaScript file, and it's using the IndexedDB APIs. It's not that file, it's this one. Okay, so within this file, it's It might look a little scary if you've not seen this kind of code before, but it's not too bad. It's only 36 lines of code. And that 36 lines is enough to define the actual data schema for our database. So we've got these 3 tables that I showed you before. It also defines the primary keys and indexes that we want to use. It's all really simple. And then it's got a bunch of general purpose methods for getting stuff from a certain table, putting stuff into a table, deleting stuff. It's all by the particular primary key. And then we've also got an example of an application specific query here. So that's how the autocomplete works. When you start typing some text in, it's going to fetch the first n results from the particular store where we've got all the vehicles in. And then in order to actually call that JavaScript code from .NET, we've got a service called local vehicle store, which goes into the dependency injection container. And that just wraps up all those JavaScript methods in a nice kind of .NET interface. So if we want to get all of the outstanding local edits that haven't been synchronized to the server, we can tell the JavaScript interop system to call this function, local vehicle store get all, and then we'll get everything from that particular table. And similarly, we've got some logic for synchronizing stuff to the server, which is quite straightforward. We're just going to iterate over all the outstanding edits. And for each one of them, we're going to send a put request to the server to send the edit up to the server. We'll check that the server agrees that that's successful and there were no validation errors. And if that works, then we can delete the local edit. And then ultimately, we can ask the server to give us a list of changes that other people have submitted as well. So it's pretty simple stuff. It's just a nice way of wrapping up some JavaScript APIs in a .NET shape so that you can consume it as a nice service throughout your application. That sound good?
Yeah.
Steve was asking about the file uploads and how that was being handled. They wanted to know, like, are the images encoded into the URL? What does that look like?
Yeah, all right then. So, okay, so there's actually 2 different ways that images get uploaded in this application. And if we haven't, I don't know if we've really got time to dig into this sort of stuff, but since you've asked, inside the vehicle, where was that code that we had before? It was the vehicle note editor. All right, so when you choose a photo, the way I've set it up in this case is quite simplistic. We're just converting it to a data URL. So that's a big base 64 encoded representation of the image that we're just sticking into a string property on the vehicle. And now that's really convenient given the way this offline store works, because it all just becomes part of this IndexedDB database, and we don't have to do anything special about it. And it's part of the normal validation system and such. So for sufficiently small images, this works great. And in this case, we've got JPEGs of this resolution. So they'll only be about 50 kilobytes, and it works fine for that. If you want to deal with much larger images, then you might want to look at a different way of uploading images in a more of a binary way. And we've got an example of that in this damage detection component. So you remember when I chose that picture of the scratched vehicle and I clicked on detect damage. Well, what that did is it called this method here, perform damage detection, and that gets the image as a byte array. In this case, it's having to convert it back from the data URL, but if you didn't use a data URL in the first place, you would already have had a byte array. And then with that byte array, we can just do an HTTP post to an endpoint on the server, just sending it as pure binary content, and then the server can receive that byte array and do whatever it wants with it. So that's the low overhead way of sending images to the server. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Mm-hmm.
I hope so. All right. All right, so I will move on then. So next thing, debugging. All right, so Safir is going to give you a demo of some cool new debugging features in just a minute. But before we get to that, I want to show you what the existing debugging support looks like with Visual Studio. So I'm going to press F5 now to start up my application with a debugger. So that's going to open up a new browser instance. And I don't actually know whether I'm going to be logged in or not when this comes up, because it's working on a separate profile, and that's all because we need the browser to open its remote debugging port so that we can connect to it from Visual Studio. So when that comes up, let's see. Yes, we are logged in. That's good. All right. So let's go back to that car that we wanted to check the damage on before. So with this picture of the scratches, I'm going to set some breakpoints now. I'm going to set breakpoints first in the client-side code that's running on WebAssembly. So I'll go into this damage detection component where we already are, in fact, and I'll set a breakpoint here before we send the image to the server, and I'll set another breakpoint after we get the result back from the server. And to show that this is really full stack debugging, I am also going to set a breakpoint on the server-side code here inside my MVC controller, like that. Okay, so we've got breakpoints on both sides of the wire now, within a single debugging session. And I'll hit detect damage, and we'll see that immediately we hit the client-side code. So this is running on WebAssembly, and VS is connecting to that in the browser. And we can inspect, we can see that is detecting damage is initially false, but if I press F10, then is detecting damage becomes true, and we can follow through that chain of execution. But I'm going to press F5 right now, and we'll see that we now hit the server-side code. So we're jumping directly from client-side code to server-side code, and we can step through that, and we can see how it makes this call into ML.NET to check for the damage score. And I'm going to press F5 again, and now we will see, well, it takes a moment because it has to spin up the ML code, but when it's done that, we then hit the code back on the client again. And I can now inspect the response that's come back, and we can see that the damage detection result is damage true with this 94% confidence. And I can press F5 one more time, and we will end up back in the browser, and you'll see the result in the UI. So I hope people agree that this is a pretty cool experience now, the fact that we can just set breakpoints wherever we want in both server and client-side code and step between them. It makes for a very fluid full stack dev experience. Now that's just Visual Studio though, which obviously is limited to, well, VS for Windows is limited to Windows, but we know a lot of people want to do their debugging in Visual Studio Code. Now we do already have some support for that, but it's going to get a lot cooler very soon, and Safia is going to give you a demo of that. So can I hand over to you, Safia, for that?
Yes, you
now?
can. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my entire screen to you folks. Cool. Can everyone see my VS Code window?
Looks good.
Yeah.
Yep.
Great. So what you're going to see here is the current debugging experience for Blazor WebAssembly on VS Code. Whenever you open a Blazor WebAssembly application, you'll be prompted to create a launch configuration, which is how VS Code determines what kinds of things it should run when you start a debugging session. This is what the launch configuration looks like now. The key thing to notice about it is it's a two-step process. So the first thing that you have to do is you have to launch the Blazor application as a standalone app. So I'm going to go ahead and run that, and it's going to start running my application. And the next thing I have to do is I have to launch the debugger, the Chrome debugger for my application. So it's going to go ahead and do that now. Now that I've got this application open, I can actually start to hit some breakpoints that I've set in my application. Here I'm inside a breakpoint and then an event handler. And I can go ahead and do what I might typically expect to do. I can view the value of properties in the debug console, hover over and view the value of properties, things like that. So that's what the debugging experience looks like now. Once I'm done, I'm going to shut down the debugging session. Of course, I have to shut down 2 debugging sessions because it's a 2-step process. Now, you might notice that I'm on a Mac, not on Windows. So there's another thing that I have to do, which is I have to clean up some lingering processes that were created but weren't cleaned up after I finished my debugging session. So I'm going to hop over to my terminal and do that now. So this is the gnarly business that you have to get into to make sure that things are cleaned up properly when you're debugging with the previous VS Code experience. Now, there's a lot going on there. That launch configuration was just so complicated. The fact that I had to do it in 2 steps, and then the fact that I had to go out and clean up some processes that were still running on my machine after I finished the debugging session. This is the past. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this launch configuration altogether and show you what the new experience for debugging Blazor WebAssembly applications in VS Code looks like. The first thing about it is it's a 1-step process. And to prove that, I'm actually going to use a fun little feature. I'm on a Mac, so I've got my touch bar, my magic touch bar. And if you use VS Code on Mac, the magic touch bar has by default the debug button as one of the buttons you can click. So I'm going to go ahead and press that. You can't see me pressing it on my keyboard, but trust me that I'm about to start debugging. And you can see here that now I'm prompted to select an environment. I've got some options like .NET Core and Node.js, but then there's also this Blazor WebAssembly debug option. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. And what's going to happen is that my application is going to be launched, And a browser is going to be open so that it can debug into my application. Let's go ahead and do that. We can go through the same process. We can hover over values, inspect the property in our debug console. And this works for, event handlers. It's also going to work for lifecycle methods on your components. So if I open another page that I have here, I've set another breakpoint that is going to be hit when I open the application once the component is initialized. So I can hit that as well. I can hover over values, step over the whole shebang. What's really cool about this is it's a one-step process, and when I close the debugging session, I can just hit stop and everything is cleaned up properly for me. The magic that's powering this under the hood is a new Blazor WebAssembly debug adapter. So the launch configuration that is used has a Blazor WASM type. VS Code has a debug adapter extension point, which essentially allows programming languages like Python or C# or Node to define what happens when a user starts a debug session, steps through code, yada, yada. Now that we have a Blazor WASM debug adapter, the debugging experience for Blazor on VS Code is now a first-class experience. So as we continue to improve it and ship out new features, you'll be able to see all of that under this debug adapter. It's kind of unique in the fact that Blazor is, just as first class as Python or C# in the debugging experience in VS Code. This is going to be shipping in the upcoming release of the OmniSharp extension, which you should expect to see within the week or so. And you can start to use this right away for debugging standalone and hosted applications on VS Code across all platforms. This includes Windows, Mac, and Linux. So that's some of the coolness that's coming for debugging Blazor WebAssembly applications in VS Code. And I will hand it back to you, Steve, to finish off the demos.
Yeah, awesome. That is super cool. That is also the first time I've seen that, and amazing. So I guess we just did the code review just then. Also approved, ship it.
And for folks that don't know, the OmniSharp extension just comes with the C# extension. So if you have the C# extension in a week or so, like, you should be getting this new improved Visual Studio Code debugging experience for Blazor WebAssembly.
Yeah. Any questions on the chat before I hand it off? I'm not sure.
People are just really excited to see it. Let me see. There were some questions on whether what you can type in the debug console, if you can type in arbitrary expressions or things there. So, yeah.
Yeah, there are some limitations there. We are aiming to cover 90% of what anyone's ever going to do realistically. We're not going to have 100% coverage anytime soon, because if you can imagine what that means, it means being able to compile arbitrary C#, and since the compiler doesn't actually exist at this point within the whole dev and execution cycle, there's only so much we can go with that. But yeah, it should be the vast majority of things that people need to do.
All right, I will hand it off to you, Steve. Thank you.
All right, awesome.
Awesome, thanks, Safia.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right then. So where are we now? I'm gonna move a bit quicker through these next two things because I think we've been taking a long time. So next one, internationalization. Not to suggest it's not important. Of course it is. It's just so effortlessly simple that you'll barely need to see it. You'll just be delighted by it, and we can move on. All right.
It translates itself basically.
Yeah, that's right.
Using ML.
Yes, it's the universal translator we've just invented. So, right, my application is in English, as you can see, actual English, British English. But let's say that I don't want to speak English anymore. I want to speak a different language. So I'm going to change my browser settings. So how do I do that? Let's go to settings and then languages, and then I'm in a wrong browser altogether, aren't I? That's why that was confusing to me. This is my normal browser here, and I'll have to restart my application server. There we go. Could have done all that while Safia was talking. All right, so here I am back in my normal browser, and it's in English, and I'm going to go to the language settings here, and I'm going to change my preference to Spanish, like that. So then I come back, and I hit reload, and what happens is it's now all Spanish. Now, not just the front page, but all the different parts of it, apart from, of course, things that users have entered. So why is that, and what's actually going on there? Well, what's going on is that we've integrated the normal regex-based string localization feature that ASP.NET developers will recognize from server-side code into Blazor WebAssembly. So to see that in actual code form, let's have a look at some of the stuff on this index.razor page, which is the home page. And you'll see that we're injecting an iString localizer. That's something we've got support for now. It's not actually turned on in the services by default. You have to go to your DI configuration and add localization. In this case, I've also given a path to some resource files. I'll show you in a sec. So you can inject your string localizer, and then whenever you want to have a string, you read it as a property out of localize like that. And you can use formatting strings if you want to inject other bits of text into it. And you can see I've done that everywhere throughout my application. And then at runtime, the Blazor WebAssembly runtime knows about the satellite assemblies that get generated by the compiler. So here I've got an app.es.regex, and if I open that, you'll see that I've got Spanish translations for all of these different strings, helpfully provided by Javier on our team. So thanks, Javier, for that. And so that's where all these strings are coming from. And one of the nice things about this design is that you don't have to localize everything up front. You can do it incrementally. So as an example of that, if I open this, you'll see that these two strings, manage account and log out, they're not localized. Why is that? Well, let's have a look at the login status. And the main reason why they're not localized is just that they're hard-coded, right? But if I wanted to localize them, I could start doing the same thing that we had before, at localize, and then read this as a string like that. And if I do that and I don't actually have translations for these things in my regex file, which I don't, then is that going to be an error? The answer is no, it's not an error. The behavior by default, if there's no translation found, is just to display the original text, which means that as a developer, you can just freely localize all the different strings that you see anywhere in your application, and it doesn't change the behavior of anything at runtime. And then someone else can later come along and add translations for the strings into your regex file, and they will just start showing up. So I hope that makes sense. I'm going to move on or are there questions?
There's one quick question, which is asking about localization in URLs.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a good question. I don't think we've really got any features around localizing URLs. It depends. I'd be interested to know what the requirements are. What features are being requested here? We've got the ability to have multiple different URL formats. So you could take whatever the Spanish for vehicle is. Let's see if I can find it. I don't know. Whatever, Spanish car. So you could add multiple URL patterns. I don't suppose that's really a particularly scalable technique. I don't really know what is being requested here. If the person posting the question wants to file an issue on GitHub and talk about the requirements, I would be really interested in getting into that.
And then this is using the standard localization support in ASP.NET Core, right? So there's like, for instance, there's a query string request culture provider, and there's some other support that's just in ASP.NET Core that they could use for server-side stuff as well.
Yeah, so it's not got anything to do with query strings, because for server-side ASP.NET Core, the only way you can know about the user's culture is, well, the main way to know about it is the language's header that comes with the requests, but also you could set up a custom scheme around query strings. When you're running client-side, there's a different way to know about it, which is a built-in JavaScript API inside browsers, which corresponds to the user's settings, and that's what we use by default. If you want to customize it in a different way, then the way you would do it is you would go into your program main, and you would write something like current culture equals, and then you would use whatever logic you want, for example, based on URLs, or you could use JavaScript interop to read stuff out of local storage, or anything else that you want to determine what culture this user should be in, and you would set it that way.
Great.
Okay. All right then, final area, progressive web apps. So this is one of the really nice places where all the features within a client-side technology like Blazor WebAssembly come together to give you this the ability to build different kinds of apps that you couldn't have built 5 years ago. So let's say that we want this application to look and feel more like a desktop application. Well, that's something that is available for progressive web applications. They can be installed into the user's operating system. They can work offline, and they can access other capabilities such as the ability to receive notifications from the server even when the user's not on the site, and to do things like upgrading themselves in the background and things that only native applications would normally be able to do. And that is something that we've got built into Blazor WebAssembly, because we've got a PWA template in the box. And what that gives you is some files that tell the browser how to behave. So we've got things like this manifest file here that defines what the name of the app is and its icon and colors and things like that. And the fact that we've got that file there causes the browser to display this plus button here. You can see it's prompting the user to install Car Checker. So if I click that, I get this option to install the application. And I'll do that, and you'll see it now pops up in its own separate window with its own color scheme. It doesn't look like a browser anymore, and you can launch this directly from the start menu. So if I close that down and I start typing Car Checker, you can see it shows up on the start menu now. If I was on a Mac, it might be on my dock. If I was on a mobile, it might be on my home screen. And for some interesting reason, I seem to have somehow broken. Oh no, there it is. Anyway, so there we go. It's working. And it respects all my preferences around languages and things like that. The other nice thing is that it can work offline. So let's see if this does work offline, shall we? I'll give you a clue. It's not going to just yet, but let's just go through the process of finding out. In my browser, I'm going to simulate being offline like that. Okay, so now I'm going to right click and choose refresh, which is equivalent to starting up the application when you don't have any network connection. And we'll see if it can successfully work offline. And the answer is no. It cannot. We've just got an error because we're not connected. Okay, so why is that? I've just been saying that PWAs work offline, so why doesn't this one? The answer is that by default, we only enable offline support for published applications. And the reason for that is because offline capable applications update themselves asynchronously in the background. And if that was the case during development, it would be incredibly annoying, because every time you make a change, you want to see that change immediately. You don't want to wait for some kind of background update process to go through. So we only enable offline support for published applications. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to have to publish my application, and I will do that on the command line. So I'm going to go down here. I'm going to type .NET publish in release configuration there, and that's going to go through this publish process. Just to a folder on my local disk. And it takes a few moments because during publish, we're also running the tree shaking process, the linking process, which strips all the unneeded code out of the application to make it a lot smaller. We're also doing a very expensive form of Brotli pre-compression, where we do a lot of CPU work up front to produce much smaller files, which can also be decompressed almost instantly. That's the Brotli pre-compression feature. So it does take a few seconds when you publish, maybe 10 or 20 seconds. As you can see, I'm filling in verbally. And now that's finished, I'm going to CD into the directory that's just been created there. There we go. And now I can .NET run that. So we'll now have the actual published application. I'm going to copy that URL into my browser there, and we can now get the actual published application. Now, I'm going to have to log out because I am in a completely different port now, which has confused my server. So let's log back in. Okay. And here we go. Right, great. So I'm logged in. Now you can see that well, I should change back to English, otherwise everyone's going to get confused, apart from Spanish people. Right. Right then, there we go. So you can see that the updates are going through right now. We're online. That's all good. Let's say I now go offline using the same technique that I did before. So simulate being offline, and I'll hit reload. Do we get an error message this time? The answer is no, we don't get an error message. It comes up. You can see all these red things on the right, which shows that we're failing to talk to the server. And you can see the message in the UI saying that we can't sync at the moment, but the page loads and we can go in and we can start making changes. Let's change this to half full and I'll hit save. Now, of course, I'm offline, so we can't synchronize this to the server. That's one of the nice things of having a local database. We can store the unsynchronized edits, and even if the user goes away and comes back later, which I can simulate by reloading the page, the edits are still there, waiting to be synchronized. So if our staff member walks back over to the office now, where they get within range of Wi-Fi, so we'll simulate that by going online, they can hit retry, and now the update actually goes through. So we've got a really nice way of interacting with our data, even when we are offline. And then the final way that I want to show you the experience around PWAs is to do with a real mobile device. So let's see if I can show you my mobile phone. Let's see, here it is. Okay, so this is my phone, and as you can see, I've installed the Car Checker app onto my home screen. It's the same app that you're seeing in my browser there, with the same icon and everything. It's obviously the same thing. And when I open that, it comes up in a screen all of its own. It doesn't have the Safari UI around it. You can see it fills up the whole area and the curved areas and everything like that. And it just behaves the same thing in the same way as before. So everything works exactly as before. I can be fully offline if I want to and synchronize my changes back later. So the only point of me showing you that is just to show that, you know, things can actually show up in a nice way on users' home screens. And like I said, when you change your application, updates are pushed asynchronously in the background to your users. Okay, so I think that's all I am going to cover, which means that I will hand back to our MC now for any questions, or where else are we going to go from here?
So we're kind of at time. If there are any big questions, Dan, you've been answering a lot of questions in here. Any that you want to call out as?
Let me just, I know a lot of the questions were about future features, like things that are coming. I'm going to share my screen real fast. This is the slide we shared at Build as well. This is the set of stuff that we're looking at in the .NET 5 and .NET 6 wave. First things first is that we are moving Blazor WebAssembly into .NET 5. If you've been following with .NET 5, there's no Blazor WebAssembly in the box yet. That will be coming in a soon-to-be-released preview. So we'll move Blazor WebAssembly into .NET 5, and then we have a whole bunch of improvements that we want to do. A bunch of component model improvements, like support for type constraints, required component parameters, support for async disposable and components. And then I know a lot of the features that people were asking about, like, is there going to be hot reload? That's on our backlog to address. We're still working out exactly what that will look like and how it will be implemented, but we do want to have a really great dev inner loop experience, what we call that, like the workflow of how you make changes and see them in the browser, in the UI as quickly as possible. CSS isolation is something we're looking at right now, as well as a bunch of WebAssembly related enhancements like support for multi-threading, lazy loading of different parts of the app, and of course, performance improvements. Right now, we are running on an IL interpreter, which is very functional, but not the fastest thing on the planet. If you know, people sometimes ask us about comparisons with Blazor WebAssembly versus like a JavaScript implementation. And it is quite a bit slower. It's not a great setup right now for like CPU intensive workloads. But one of the things we're looking at in .NET 5, .NET 6 is improving that performance with support for things like ahead of time compilation or other performance improvements. So these are things that we're looking at and that you can look forward to in a future release.
Wow, very cool. Okay, and then just to kind of wrap up, what's the best way for people to kind of get involved, keep up with what's going on? There's Blazor.net is kind of the answers most of my question there.
That's where you go to get started, to get the bits. Go to Blazor.net, download and try out Blazor WebAssembly. So it's ready for production use. If you have feedback that you'd like to share with us, as always, we're on GitHub. Just post issues on the GitHub repo and let us know what you're interested in. I think the last area that people were also asking about was like, well, what about beyond the web? Like, what about like you know, desktop scenarios and mobile app scenarios for Blazor? If you've been following along with the mobile Blazor bindings experimental project, encourage you to continue to do so. That's where we're planning to do release more innovations in that space, like enabling support not only for native UI, but also like hybrid UI scenarios, like working with web and HTML and CSS within native app scenarios. So follow along with that project, and hopefully you'll see some cool updates coming out soon there.
Awesome. Well, here, let me switch back so we can do a proper goodbye here. If you can unshare your screen.
Unshare my screen. Oh, that.
Wonderful. That was amazing. Well, congratulations on the release, and thanks for the amazing demos. Safia, welcome, and this was really cool demos. Looking forward to trying that out. So, thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
All right. Goodbye. Thanks for all the great questions too, folks. All right. Bye.